Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her friends spent weekends at the mall, she was at the local airfield, watching planes take off and land with wide-eyed fascination. Her father, a former Air Force mechanic, had taught her everything about aircraft engines before she turned 16. By 18, she had her private pilot license and dreams bigger than the endless Texas sky. The military recruitment office in downtown Austin became her second home during her senior year of high school. Sarah knew exactly what she wanted: to become a military pilot. The recruiters, mostly middle-aged men who had seen countless young people with similar dreams, smiled politely, but weren't particularly encouraging. Flying combat aircraft was still a male-dominated field, and while women were allowed in combat roles, the reality was harsh and competitive. Despite the lukewarm reception, Sarah enlisted in the Army right after graduation. Her test scores were exceptional, particularly in spatial reasoning and mechanical aptitude. During basic training at Fort Moore, she outperformed most of her male counterparts in physical fitness and technical evaluations. Her drill sergeants noticed her determination and recommended her for flight training. The helicopter flight school at Fort Novosel in Alabama was where Sarah's real journey began. The program was intense, designed to break those who weren't completely committed. Many of her classmates were cocky young men who had grown up playing flight simulator games and watching Top Gun movies. They assumed flying helicopters would be similar to their gaming experiences. Sarah approached training differently. She studied every manual, memorized every procedure, and spent extra hours in the simulators when others were relaxing. Her instructors, initially skeptical about her small frame and quiet demeanor, gradually began to notice her exceptional skills. She had a natural feel for helicopter controls and an uncanny ability to maintain calm under pressure. During her time in flight school, Sarah met Lieutenant Jake Reynolds, a brash pilot from California who was training to fly Apache attack helicopters. Jake was everything Sarah wasn't: loud, overconfident, and constantly joking around. He had been a football star in college and carried that same swagger into his military career. While Sarah was studying, Jake was usually holding court in the mess hall, entertaining other students with stories of his supposed flying prowess. Jake represented the old guard mentality that still existed in military aviation. He genuinely believed that women, while capable of flying transport helicopters or reconnaissance aircraft, didn't belong in attack helicopters. The Apache was a weapon of war, he argued, requiring split-second decisions and the ability to engage enemy targets while under fire. In his mind, it was simply too much for most women to handle. Sarah initially tried to ignore Jake's comments and attitude. She focused on her training, consistently ranking in the top 5% of her class. Her instructors began discussing her potential for advanced training, possibly including the Apache program. The AH-64 Apache was the Army's premier attack helicopter, a sophisticated machine that required exceptional skill and mental toughness to operate effectively. The Apache wasn't just a helicopter. It was a flying computer with enough firepower to destroy entire tank columns. It required a pilot and a co-pilot gunner, working in perfect coordination to navigate, target, and engage enemies while avoiding anti-aircraft fire. The training program was notoriously difficult, with a high washout rate, even among experienced pilots. As Sarah progressed through flight school, the competition among students intensified. Everyone wanted the most prestigious assignments, and Apache pilot slots were limited and highly coveted. Jake had already been selected for Apache training, a fact he mentioned frequently and loudly. His family connections, his father was a retired Army colonel, hadn't hurt his chances. Sarah's own journey toward Apache qualification was less certain. While her flight performance was outstanding, some instructors still harbored doubts about women in attack helicopters. The physical demands were significant, as was the psychological pressure of combat operations. Critics pointed to the fact that very few women had successfully completed Apache training. One evening in the mess hall, as Sarah sat quietly eating dinner and reviewing her flight notes, Jake approached her table with several of his friends. He had clearly been drinking, though not enough to be obviously intoxicated. His mood was jovial but with an underlying edge of meanness that Sarah had learned to recognize. "Hey Martinez," Jake called out loudly enough for most of the mess hall to hear. I heard you're thinking about applying for Apache training. That's pretty ambitious for someone your size. Jake called out loudly. Also Binsney and Lance. Jake called out loudly enough for Apache training. Sarah looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. She had learned not to react to Jake's provocations, knowing that any emotional response would only encourage him and provide ammunition for his argument that women were too emotional for combat roles. I'm considering all my options, Sarah replied calmly, returning her attention to her flight manual. Jake wasn't satisfied with her non-reaction. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his friends gathering around the table like a pack of hyenas sensing entertainment. Come on, Sarah. Be realistic. The Apache is a serious machine. It's not like the training helicopters you've been flying. This thing has real weapons, real firepower. When you're flying combat missions, you need someone who can handle the pressure and make tough decisions. No offense, but I've never seen a woman who could handle that kind of intensity. Other students in the mess hall had begun to take notice of the conversation. Some looked uncomfortable with Jake's comments, while others seemed entertained by the brewing confrontation. Sarah felt the familiar flush of anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice level and professional. I appreciate your concern about my career choices, Jake, but I think I can make my own decisions about what I'm capable of handling. Jake leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. His friends exchanged glances, sensing that their leader was building up to something bigger. Look, I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just being honest. Flying an Apache isn't like flying a civilian aircraft, or even a transport helicopter. You're talking about a weapon system that costs $35 million. The Army invests serious money in training Apache pilots because lives depend on their skills. When your buddies on the ground are taking fire and calling for close air support, they need to know that the pilot overhead can deliver precision strikes without hesitation. Sarah closed her flight manual and looked directly at Jake. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel in her tone that made several of his friends shift uncomfortably. And you think I'm incapable of that because I'm a woman? I think you're incapable of that because you're not aggressive enough. You're too careful, too methodical. That works fine in training, but combat is different. Sometimes you need to make split-second decisions based on instinct, not careful analysis. The mess hall had grown quieter as more students tuned into the conversation. Some of the female students present looked embarrassed and uncomfortable, while several male students seemed eager to see how the confrontation would develop. Sarah stood up slowly, gathering her books and preparing to leave. She had no interest in providing entertainment for Jake and his audience, but as she turned to go, Jake made one final comment that stopped her in her tracks. Tell you what, Martinez, if you're so confident in your flying abilities, why don't you prove it? There's an Apache simulator session scheduled for tomorrow morning. Why don't you show us all how good you really are? Sarah turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. What exactly are you suggesting? Jake's grin widened. He was clearly enjoying the attention and the opportunity to publicly challenge someone he viewed as inferior. I'm suggesting we settle this once and for all. You take the Apache simulator tomorrow, run through some basic maneuvers, and show everyone that you can handle it. If you can prove you belong in an Apache cockpit, I'll personally recommend you for the training program. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Sarah knew it was a trap of some kind, but she couldn't see the specific danger. Jake was too confident, too amused by his own suggestion. There was something he wasn't telling her, some aspect of the challenge that gave him an unfair advantage. And if I don't meet your standards? Sarah asked. Then you admit that some people just aren't cut out for certain roles in the military. No shame in that. Plenty of important jobs don't require flying attack helicopters. Sarah studied Jake's face, trying to read his intentions. His friends were grinning now, clearly in on whatever joke their leader was setting up. The rest of the mess hall waited for her response, and Sarah realized that backing down now would essentially validate every doubt about her capabilities. Fine, she said simply. Tomorrow morning. But I have one condition. Jake raised an eyebrow, surprised that she had accepted so readily. What's that? If I prove I can handle the Apache, you stop making comments about women in combat roles. Not just about me, but about all women in the program. Jake's grin never wavered. He stuck out his hand with the confidence of someone who knew he held all the cards. Deal. As Sarah shook his hand, she noticed the smirks on his friends' faces and realized she had probably just agreed to something that would humiliate her in front of her entire class. But there was no backing down now. Tomorrow morning would either prove her point or destroy her credibility entirely. Sarah spent a restless night thinking about Jake's challenge and trying to figure out what trap he had laid for her. She knew Jake well enough by now to understand that he wouldn't have made the bet unless he was certain of winning. There had to be some aspect of the Apache simulator that she wasn't aware of, some detail that would give him an unfair advantage. Early the next morning, Sarah arrived at the simulation center before anyone else. She wanted to examine the Apache simulator and familiarize herself with its controls before the appointed time. The AH-64 Apache simulator was an impressive piece of technology, designed to replicate every aspect of flying the actual helicopter. The cockpit was an exact replica, complete with all the instruments, switches, and controls found in the real aircraft. As Sarah studied the simulator's setup, she began to understand the complexity of what she had agreed to attempt. The Apache required coordination between the pilot and the co-pilot gunner, with different responsibilities and control systems. The pilot, seated in the rear cockpit, controlled the helicopter's flight systems, while the co-pilot gunner in the front cockpit managed the weapon systems and targeting equipment. What worried Sarah most was that she had never actually flown an Apache, even in simulation. Her training had focused on smaller, less complex helicopters. The Apache's controls were similar but far more sophisticated, with additional systems for navigation, targeting, and weapons control. She would essentially be attempting to fly an unfamiliar aircraft in front of an audience that expected her to fail. 20 minutes before the scheduled time, other students began arriving at the simulation center. Word had spread quickly through the flight school about the challenge, and it seemed like half the student body wanted to witness the confrontation. Sarah noticed several instructors arriving as well, including Major Thompson, the Apache program director. Jake arrived precisely on time, flanked by his usual group of supporters. He was clearly enjoying the attention and the opportunity to prove his point about women in combat aviation. His confidence seemed even more pronounced than usual, confirming Sarah's suspicion that he knew something she didn't. "Ready to show us what you've got, Martinez?" Jake called out cheerfully. "Don't worry if you can't figure out the controls. These simulators can be pretty overwhelming for someone who's never seen an Apache cockpit before." That comment made Sarah pause. How did Jake know she had never been in an Apache simulator? She had assumed that detail wasn't widely known. But apparently Jake had done his homework. He knew exactly what he was asking her to do: attempt to fly an unfamiliar aircraft with no preparation or training. Major Thompson stepped forward, looking uncomfortable with the entire situation. He was a career Army officer who had flown Apaches in combat and understood the seriousness of the aircraft. Turning the simulator into entertainment for students didn't sit well with his professional sensibilities. "What exactly is going on here?" Major Thompson asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Jake quickly explained the situation, presenting it as a friendly wager about pilot capabilities rather than the more problematic challenge to women's place in combat aviation that it actually was. Major Thompson listened with growing displeasure, clearly understanding the underlying tensions involved. "This is highly irregular," Major Thompson said firmly. "The Apache simulator is not a toy for settling personal disputes. It's a training tool for serious pilots who have been selected for the program." Sarah realized this might be her chance to back out gracefully, with Major Thompson providing the excuse she needed. But backing down now would accomplish exactly what Jake wanted: public confirmation that she couldn't handle the pressure and responsibility of flying an attack helicopter. "Sir, if you don't mind, I'd like to try," Sarah said respectfully but firmly. "I understand this isn't standard procedure, but I believe it would be a valuable learning experience." Major Thompson studied her face, clearly trying to assess her motivation and mental state. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Very well. But I want to be clear about something. Flying an Apache, even in simulation, is not a game. This aircraft represents millions of dollars of taxpayer money and, more importantly, the lives of soldiers who depend on Apache support in combat. If you're going to do this, you'll do it properly, with the respect and seriousness it deserves. Sarah nodded, feeling both grateful for the opportunity and terrified of the challenge ahead. Major Thompson's words had reminded everyone present that this wasn't just about personal pride or gender politics. The Apache was a weapon of war, and the skills required to operate it had life or death consequences in real combat situations. Jake, since this was your idea, you can serve as the instructor. Major Thompson continued. Walk her through the basic controls and procedures. I want to see a proper pre-flight check, basic maneuvers, and emergency procedures. This isn't a performance, it's a training exercise. Jake's expression shifted slightly at Major Thompson's words. He had clearly expected a more informal demonstration where Sarah would simply climb into the cockpit and try to figure things out on her own. Having to actually teach her the procedures first would reduce the entertainment value and give her a better chance of success. Of course, sir, Jake replied, though his enthusiasm seemed slightly diminished. The next 30 minutes were among the most intense of Sarah's military career. Jake, under Major Thompson's watchful eye, was forced to provide a genuine tutorial on Apache operations. He explained the function of various instruments, the proper startup procedures, and basic flight controls. Despite his obvious reluctance, Jake was actually a competent instructor when properly motivated. Sarah absorbed every detail with the focused intensity she brought to all her studies. She asked specific questions about control sensitivity, emergency procedures, and systems integration. Several times, Jake seemed surprised by the sophistication of her questions, which demonstrated a deeper understanding of helicopter operations than he had expected. As they went through the procedures, Sarah began to understand why Jake had been so confident about the challenge. The Apache was significantly more complex than any aircraft she had previously flown. The weapons systems alone required extensive training to master, and the coordination between pilot and gunner was unlike anything in civilian or basic military aviation. When the tutorial was complete, Major Thompson addressed the growing crowd of spectators. This is a training exercise, not entertainment. I want complete silence during the simulation. Any disruption will result in immediate removal from this facility. Sarah climbed into the rear cockpit, which was the pilot's position. Jake, somewhat reluctantly, took the front seat as the co-pilot gunner. This arrangement meant that he would be responsible for weapons systems and targeting, while Sarah handled the actual flying. It was a setup that should have favored her, since flying was her strongest skill. The simulation began with a standard startup procedure. Sarah methodically worked through the checklist, starting engines, checking instruments, and preparing for takeoff. Her movements were careful and deliberate, showing none of the uncertainty that many students displayed when first encountering unfamiliar aircraft. Jake, monitoring her performance from the front cockpit, seemed genuinely surprised by her competence. He had expected her to struggle with the basic procedures, but Sarah was executing each step properly and confidently. Major Thompson, watching from outside the simulator, nodded approvingly at her methodical approach. The takeoff went smoothly. Sarah lifted the simulated Apache off the ground with the same steady control she had demonstrated in smaller helicopters. Her years of studying aircraft systems and her natural feel for flying were serving her well, even in this unfamiliar aircraft. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah demonstrated basic flight maneuvers. She executed turns, climbs, and descents with increasing confidence. The Apache's controls were more sensitive than she was used to, but she adapted quickly, showing the kind of natural pilot instinct that couldn't be taught. Jake, growing increasingly uncomfortable with Sarah's competent performance, decided to escalate the challenge. He activated a combat scenario without warning Sarah, suddenly filling their screens with simulated enemy targets and incoming threats. "Incoming missiles," Jake shouted, deliberately trying to rattle Sarah with the sudden change in situation. "We need evasive maneuvers now." This was the trap Jake had been planning all along. He had waited until Sarah was comfortable with basic flying before introducing combat scenarios that required split-second decisions and aggressive maneuvering. He expected her to panic or freeze when faced with simulated combat conditions. Instead, Sarah's reaction surprised everyone in the room. Without hesitation, she banked the helicopter sharply left, using terrain features to break the missile lock while maintaining control of the aircraft. Her movements were not the careful, methodical actions she had shown during basic maneuvers, but the quick, instinctive responses of a natural combat pilot. "Target the enemy vehicles," Sarah called to Jake, her voice calm and focused despite the simulated danger. "I'll position us for attack runs." For the next several minutes, Sarah flew the simulated Apache through a complex combat scenario, evading enemy fire while positioning Jake for accurate targeting. She demonstrated an intuitive understanding of attack helicopter tactics, using terrain masking and aggressive maneuvering to avoid threats while maintaining offensive capability. Jake, despite his best efforts to complicate the situation, found himself struggling to keep up with Sarah's flying. She was positioning the aircraft for optimal targeting solutions while simultaneously avoiding multiple threats. It was exactly the kind of multitasking and pressure management that he had claimed women couldn't handle. Major Thompson watched in amazement as Sarah executed maneuvers that some of his advanced students struggled with. She was flying the Apache as if she had years of experience, showing the kind of natural ability that appeared maybe once in every 100 pilot candidates. As the scenario intensified, with more enemy targets and increased threat levels, Sarah's performance only improved. She seemed to thrive under pressure, making quick decisions and executing complex maneuvers with growing confidence. Her flying had evolved from competent to exceptional in the span of 15 minutes. Jake, meanwhile, was beginning to look genuinely worried. His plan to embarrass Sarah was backfiring spectacularly. Not only was she succeeding, but she was demonstrating skills that exceeded those of most students in their class, including several who were already selected for Apache training. The crowd of spectators had grown completely silent, mesmerized by Sarah's performance. Even those who had expected her to fail were now watching with genuine admiration as she handled the simulated Apache with remarkable skill and composure. When the simulation finally ended, Sarah sat quietly in the cockpit for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had not only met Jake's challenge, but had exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. The Apache had felt natural to her, as if she had been training to fly it her entire life. The silence in the simulation center was deafening as Sarah climbed out of the Apache simulator cockpit. Every person in the room had witnessed something extraordinary. A pilot candidate with no Apache training had just completed a complex combat scenario with the kind of skill typically seen only in experienced combat pilots. Major Thompson was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and professional respect. "Outstanding performance, Martinez. I've been training Apache pilots for 8 years, and I've rarely seen that level of natural ability." He turned to address the assembled students. "What you just witnessed is exactly the kind of piloting skill the Apache program is designed to identify and develop." Jake sat frozen in the front cockpit, staring at the now blank simulation screens. His carefully planned humiliation of Sarah had instead turned into a demonstration of her exceptional abilities. Every assumption he had made about her capabilities had been shattered in the span of 20 minutes. As Jake finally climbed out of the simulator, his face was pale, and his usual swagger had completely disappeared. The students who had gathered to watch Sarah fail were now looking at her with genuine respect and admiration. Several of the female students were smiling broadly, clearly pleased to see one of their own succeed so dramatically. "Jake." Major Thompson's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "A word with you. Privately." As Major Thompson led Jake away from the group, Sarah found herself surrounded by fellow students offering congratulations and asking questions about her flying experience. The atmosphere had completely shifted from the hostile environment Jake had created the night before. "Sarah, that was incredible," said Lisa Chen, one of the few other women in the flight program. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "I honestly don't know," Sarah replied, still somewhat stunned by her own performance. "It just felt natural once I got used to the controls." Several of the male students who had remained silent during Jake's challenges the night before now approached Sarah with obvious respect. It was clear that her performance had changed their perception not just of her abilities, but of women's potential in combat aviation more generally. While Sarah answered questions and accepted congratulations, Jake was facing a very different conversation with Major Thompson in a private office down the hall. The Major's expression was stern as he closed the door behind them. "What exactly did you think you were accomplishing with that little stunt?" Major Thompson asked, his voice cold with disapproval. Jake struggled to find an answer. His plan had seemed reasonable the night before: expose Sarah's limitations in front of her peers and settle the question of women in combat roles once and for all. Now it seemed petty and unprofessional. "Sir, I was just trying to determine if she was really qualified for Apache training," Jake said weakly. "No. You were trying to humiliate a fellow student based on your personal biases," Major Thompson replied sharply. "What Martinez just demonstrated is exactly the kind of natural flying ability we're looking for in Apache pilots. You, on the other hand, just showed me that your judgment about pilot qualifications is seriously flawed." Major Thompson walked to his desk and pulled out a file folder. Jake recognized it as his own training record. "Your performance in the program has been adequate, Jake, but not exceptional. You've been selected for Apache training primarily based on your test scores and your family connections, not because you've demonstrated superior flying ability." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had assumed his Apache slot was secure, but Major Thompson's tone suggested otherwise. Martinez, on the other hand, just demonstrated skills that some of our advanced students don't possess. Her performance today was remarkable, especially considering she had never flown an Apache before. Major Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Here's what's going to happen. Martinez will be immediately transferred to the Apache training program, effective next week. As for you, your slot in the program is now conditional. You'll need to demonstrate significant improvement in both your flying skills and your professional attitude." Jake stared at Major Thompson in shock. His carefully planned challenge had not only failed to discredit Sarah but had actually accelerated her advancement while jeopardizing his own position. "Sir, with respect, I don't understand how one simulation can completely change someone's career trajectory," Jake protested. "It's not about one simulation, Jake. It's about recognizing exceptional talent when it appears. Regardless of the package it comes in, Martinez has the instincts and abilities we need in combat pilots. Your behavior today suggests you may lack the judgment and leadership qualities we require." As Major Thompson continued outlining the consequences of Jake's challenge, Sarah was dealing with a very different situation. Word of her performance had spread quickly through the flight school, and students from other programs were stopping by to congratulate her and ask about her background. Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Williams, one of the few female Apache pilots at the school, arrived at the simulation center and immediately sought out Sarah. "I heard about what happened here this morning," she said with a broad smile. "Congratulations on showing everyone what we're really capable of." Sarah appreciated the support from a veteran female pilot, but she was also somewhat uncomfortable with the attention her performance was generating. "I just did what felt natural," Sarah said modestly. "I wasn't trying to prove anything about women in combat. I was just trying to prove something about myself." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Chief Williams replied. "Whether you intended it or not, your performance today is going to open doors for other women in this program. That's something to be proud of." As the day progressed, the implications of Jake's failed challenge became increasingly clear. Sarah received official notification that she was being fast-tracked into the Apache program, skipping several preliminary courses that were normally required. Her performance in the simulator had demonstrated that she already possessed skills that other students needed months to develop. Jake, meanwhile, faced a much more difficult path forward. In addition to the conditional status of his Apache training slot, he was required to undergo counseling sessions about professional conduct and military leadership. Major Thompson had made it clear that any future incidents involving discrimination or unprofessional behavior would result in his immediate removal from the program. 3 months later, both Sarah and Jake were in advanced Apache training. But their experiences were vastly different. Sarah continued to excel, consistently ranking at the top of her class in both flying performance and leadership evaluations. Her natural abilities, combined with her serious approach to training, made her one of the most promising pilot candidates the program had seen in years. Jake struggled to keep up with the demanding training requirements. His previous confidence had been replaced by self-doubt, and his flying performance suffered as a result. The realization that his assumptions about women's capabilities had been completely wrong forced him to question many of his other beliefs about military service and leadership. One evening, as they both worked late in the flight planning room, Jake approached Sarah with obvious reluctance. It was the first time they had spoken directly since the simulator incident. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "What I did that day was wrong. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly." Sarah looked up from her flight manual, surprised by Jake's admission. She had expected him to remain bitter about the way events had unfolded. "Thank you for saying that," she replied simply. "I appreciate the apology." Jake sat down across from her, his usual arrogance completely absent. "I've been thinking a lot about that day, and I realize I wasn't just wrong about you. I was wrong about women in combat roles generally. Your performance that day was better than anything I've ever done in a simulator." Sarah appreciated Jake's honesty, but she was also wary of his sudden change in attitude. "Jake, I don't need you to become a champion of women's rights. I just need you to treat people as individuals rather than making assumptions based on their gender." "I know," Jake replied, "and I'm trying to do that. It's harder than I thought it would be. I grew up with certain ideas about what men and women were supposed to be good at, and it's difficult to change those assumptions." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Thompson, who was making his evening rounds of the training facilities. He paused when he saw them together, clearly wondering about the nature of their discussion. "How's the advanced training going?" he asked, addressing both students. "Very well, sir," Sarah replied. "The aircraft systems are more complex than anything I've worked with before, but the flying itself feels natural." Major Thompson nodded approvingly. Sarah's performance had continued to exceed expectations throughout her accelerated training program. "And you, Jake?" Major Thompson's tone was more reserved when addressing the male student. "I'm working hard to improve, sir. The training is challenging, but I'm committed to meeting the standards." Major Thompson studied both students for a moment before speaking again. "You know, what happened in that simulator 3 months ago taught everyone involved some valuable lessons. Sarah learned that she had exceptional natural abilities. Jake learned that his assumptions about other people's capabilities were flawed. And I learned that talent comes in many different forms, and we need to be better at recognizing it." 6 months after Jake's ill-conceived challenge, Sarah graduated from Apache training as the top pilot in her class. She was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment, one of the Army's premier Apache units. Her performance during training had been so exceptional that she was selected for immediate deployment to a combat zone. Jake also completed the training program, though barely. His near failure had humbled him significantly and forced him to develop better flying skills through sheer determination and hard work. He was assigned to a training unit, where he would spend the next year developing his abilities before being considered for combat deployment. The day before Sarah left for her deployment, she ran into Jake at the base commissary. He was with several other newly graduated pilots, but he separated from the group to speak with her privately. "I wanted to congratulate you on your assignment," he said sincerely. "The 227th is an elite unit. They don't take pilots unless they're truly exceptional." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "I'm excited about the opportunity to finally put all this training to use." Jake hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Sarah, I know I caused you a lot of trouble with that stupid challenge, but I want you to know that it ended up being one of the best things that ever happened to me. It forced me to confront my own limitations and prejudices. I'm a better pilot and a better person because of what happened that day." Sarah smiled slightly. She had seen genuine changes in Jake's behavior and attitude over the months since their confrontation. "I'm glad something positive came out of it for you. But Jake, the next time you want to challenge someone's abilities, maybe find a way to do it that doesn't involve public humiliation." Jake laughed ruefully. "Noted. I definitely learned that lesson the hard way." As they parted ways, both pilots reflected on how much their lives had changed since that evening in the mess hall, when Jake had made his challenge as a joke. Sarah was heading to combat as one of the Army's most promising Apache pilots, while Jake was beginning a longer journey of professional and personal development. The simulator challenge that Jake had intended as a prank had instead become a defining moment for both their careers. Sarah had discovered her exceptional natural abilities and earned the respect of her peers and instructors. Jake had been forced to confront his prejudices and develop greater humility and self-awareness. Years later, both pilots would look back on that day as a turning point in their military careers. Sarah went on to become one of the most decorated Apache pilots of her generation, while Jake eventually developed into a competent pilot and effective leader who made it his mission to ensure that other talented candidates were never underestimated based on assumptions about their background or gender. The lesson of Jake's failed joke resonated throughout the flight school long after both pilots had moved on to their operational assignments. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on prejudice, and a reminder that exceptional ability can appear in unexpected places. Most importantly, it demonstrated that sometimes the best way to prove someone wrong is simply to exceed every expectation they have set for you.